So welcome everybody. Lovely to see you all. My name is Hedi Viterbo. I'm a senior lecturer at Queen Mary University of London and director of the Childhood Law and Policy Network. And I'm delighted to welcome you all and our wonderful speakers to a webinar on childhood and disability. We'll be discussing various theoretical and practical questions surrounding this topic. Um, just to let you know before I say a bit about our speakers and the format, that this session is part of webinar series dedicated to the theme of children's bodies. So we have 4 sessions. This is the third. We've had one on children's relationship with food, so children's food practices. We've had one on children and sport and physical education. And our next session is on children's gender/sex. If you're interested in details, we will put a link in the chat in a couple of minutes, so you can check out those details if you want to attend the remaining session. I'll just also say a couple of words about the network, CLPN, Childhood Law and Policy Network. It's a network of, we have currently around 600 members who are researchers across dozens of countries working on various issues concerning childhood and children. We do all sorts of things. One of them is events, such as this one. We also publish original content. We publish interviews with authors of academic books on issues within the field of childhood studies and related topics. We publish blogs on these issues. We have a website with teaching and research resources. So if anyone's interested, I'm just plugging the network. If anyone's interested, feel free to just Google CLPN, I guess, and have a look. You're welcome to follow us. I'm really delighted to be hosting this webinar today. We have 3 excellent speakers from 3 countries. So let me say a bit about each of them. Our first speaker is Anastasia Todd, who's an assistant professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Kentucky in the US. Her research is at the intersection of disability, girlhood, and the media. Anastasia is the author of the award-winning book Cripping Girlhood, which was published last year by the University of Michigan Press. And she's also published articles in the journals Disability Studies Quarterly, NEOS, Girlhood Studies, and Society. Next, we have Antonios Ktenidis, who is a lecturer in education in the School of Education at the University of Sheffield here in the UK. His research draws on critical disability studies, disabled children's childhood studies, and inclusive education. It explores the intersections of ableism, disableism, developmentalism, and heightism in education. Antonios is also a member of the Welcome Anti-Ableist Research Cultures Project and a managing editor of the Journal of Disability Studies in Education. His work has been published in journals such as the British Journal of Sociology of Education, Children's Geographies, and the International Journal of Inclusive Education. Finally, we have Susan Flynn, who's an associate professor at the School of Social Work and Social Policy at Trinity College Dublin, at the University of Dublin in Ireland. Her research examines child and family services with a focus on disability and child protection and welfare, including theorization within critical disability studies. Susan has published multiple articles in journals such as Disability and Society, International Social Work, and Child Care in Practice. Okay, so really a fantastic panel of speakers, and I very much look forward to hearing what all 3 of you have to say. Our format today is as follows. We'll start with short presentations by the 3 speakers, each probably up to 12 minutes or so. Then we'll dedicate some time to a brief panel discussion that looks at some broader issues beyond the specific papers or presentations. And then we'll dedicate the rest of the time for Q&A, for your questions, which we'll be happy to discuss, or your comments. Just to let you all know, this session is being recorded and will be posted online afterwards. Please keep your mics muted during the presentation, just so we don't have too many background noises. But feel free to post your questions or comments in the chat throughout the session. Or if you want to ask any questions afterwards, when we turn to the Q&A part, you'll be welcome to unmute yourself, and if you want to turn on your camera and share with us your thoughts or your questions. Okay, so after all these introductions, let's start with the presentations. Anastasia, we'll start with you, and your paper is titled Disabled Girlhood and Platform Intimacies. So the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. Can everyone see my slides? Okay? Okay, great. Thank you, Hedi, for the introduction. And I just want to let everyone know that if you take a photo of the QR code there, you can get to a digital access copy of this presentation. And also there's a link to my book, which is open access. So I'll begin. In a 2020 Forbes article, Is the Social Media Generation Transforming Disability Representation? The author juxtaposes the COVID-19 pandemic and its intensification of disability crises worldwide with the power of a new narrative of disability espoused by the voices of a new generation of online disability activists. Explaining this new narrative, Casey, the author, writes that online, quote, the voices of this new generation of disabled influencers ring loud and clear. The ownership of who they are, the rejection of the old stereotypes of what it means to be disabled, and the way they are replacing them with something so humanly compelling, relatable, exciting, informed, and real. This new narrative is contrasted with disability representation of the past, which, according to the article, was like a tumbleweed across the desert, most often evoking pity, inspiration, or sympathy. The article ends with what appears to be a call to action. Quote, global disability inclusion will never be a reality without disabled people being able to recognize themselves in the images and stories of our time. Social media platforms are now teeming with voices of this new generation. One can search day in my life disability on YouTube and TikTok, for example, and hundreds of videos pop up, uploaded by a range of users, from amateur content creators to professional disability rights organizations. Some of the most trafficked YouTube vlogging channels are helmed by disabled content creators, and long gone are the days that disability and social media influencer contradict each other. My research, and most specifically my book, Cripping Girlhood, suggests that disabled girls have long been forerunners of this purported disability visibility revolution. Their self-representational practices carved out an effective scene of belonging for other disabled people on the internet. In this brief presentation, I'm going to pull out examples from my book to highlight the cultural and political work that disabled girls' self-representational practices perform. But first, I want to speak a bit about my approach to disabled girls and girlhoods. Cripping Girlhood, my book, traces how and why the disabled girl emerges quite spectacularly in 21st century US media culture, and seeks to understand the figure of the disabled girl's multivalent meaning, what her emergence and these varied representations say about 21st century disability politics, girlhood, and neoliberal anxieties about life and living, among other things. But also, Cripping Girlhood is interested in what disabled girls themselves have to tell us about what it means to be disabled girls. Often in fields that consider the disabled girl, such as education, nursing, and psychology, the disabled girl is rigidly defined through a medicalized and gender essentialist framework, and her girlhood is understood through discourses of risk and vulnerability. She is an object to theorize rather than a subject who theorizes. Even in the fields to which my project is deeply indebted, gender and women's studies and girlhood studies, the disabled girl is rarely critically engaged with. Her disability is merely understood as a trump card, according to Deborah Steinstra, as something that is all-encompassing and that explains all. Cripping Girlhood offers a new theorization of disabled girls and girlhoods. The book does so by advancing cripping girlhood as a heuristic. The project calls on the radical potential of crip, a term reclaimed and used by disability activists, cultural workers, and scholars. Crip has come to signify many things at once, an in-your-face and prideful reclamation of disability, a capacious and flexible term encompassing all sorts of non-normative embodiments, and according to Eli Clare, a word to help forge a politics. I utilize crib throughout my book and my other research projects as a term that recognizes the political and cultural power of disabled girls and girlhoods, even in the most quotidian of scenes. To crip or cripping, in the simplest of characterizations, is a practice that interrogates or unsettles assumptions about disability and disabled people, and specifically in the case of this book, assumptions about disabled girls and girlhoods. As a heuristic, I mobilize cripping girlhood in two distinct but intimately connected ways. First, I examine how disabled girls crip girlhood. In a range of cultural sites that I explore throughout the book, but most centrally on YouTube and TikTok, I show how disabled girls actively append what we think we know about them and their experience, recasting the meanings ascribed to their body minds in their own terms. Second, I mobilize cripping girlhood as an analytical practice, in which throughout each chapter I uncover how able nationalist logics, racialized and cis heteronormative discourses of ideal girlhood, and normative affects collide to facilitate the recognition and cultural valuation of certain disabled girl subjects over others. So let's move to a couple of examples wherein the disabled girl herself tells us more about disabled girlhood. Scholars of new media persuasively argue that social media has facilitated the opportunity for youth to mess around, hang out, and construct and perform their identities in ways that are not possible elsewhere. Media studies scholar Henry Jenkins spoke of burgeoning participatory cultures in the early aughts, or new patterns of media consumption characterized by contribution or production, made possible by Web 2.0's infrastructure and its contingent low barrier to artistic expression and civic engagement. For example, YouTube's first slogan, Broadcast Yourself, in inviting its everyday users to carve out their own space on the internet, exemplified participatory culture's ethos. Its platform architecture, merging both the technical aspects of media production and circulation, as well as the community and networking aspects of social media, was naively thought to engender the possibility for the democratization of content creation and knowledge distribution, as well as the potential for the playful construction of self and community. Disabled girl cripfluencers like Sharice Living with cerebral palsy and Ricky Pointer, both YouTube channels of which I have on the screen right now, long before the ubiquitous cultural presence of disability content and disabled creators, built their channels through, quote, broadcasting their intimate day-to-day, often sitting in front of a camera in their childhood bedrooms. In these early lo-fi videos, both Charisse and Ricky carved out a space on the internet, sharing their experiences and knowledge gleaned specifically from their perspective as disabled girls. From reconfiguring the able-bodied stare to claiming disability, Charisse and Ricky's public narrativization and visual documentation of the disabled quotidian participated in charting a new genre of video on YouTube, disability vlogs. They used the platform and still use the platform as a tool to unsettle or make strange and twisted what we think we know about girlhood and disability, and to create new relations of affinity outside the hegemonic strictures of ableist domination. For example, in Charisse's second most viewed video, Walking and Running with Cerebral Palsy, she authorizes what Garland Thompson would call the stare by inviting her viewers to watch her walk and run, in effect re-choreographing visual and affective relations between disabled people and their non-disabled audience. Conceptualized as an act of self-disclosure, Charisse puts the ragged edges and blunt angles of her disabled embodiment on display. In her drawn-out and slightly slurred speech, in the video, she narrates her mobility aid journey, from using a walker as a child to forearm crutches in second grade, to just one forearm crutch in third grade, and then ultimately to walking unassisted in the fourth grade. The last half of the video is an extended clip of Charisse, as the title suggests, walking and running, walking away from the camera in what looks to be an idyllic suburban backyard, with the slight sway of her arms, drag of her feet, and occasional knock of her knees. She pulls a dog on the leash behind her. She reaches a tree a few feet away from where the camera is located, and then she turns around and walks back towards the camera with a huge grin on her face. As she gets closer to the camera, she quickly turns around with the dog galloping behind her. Her body undulates slightly left to right as she runs back toward the tree, her hair swishing with the momentum of her body. The video archives a powerful visuality and visceralness of the disabled body mind, a new realism that does not hold back on provoking a matter-of-factness about CP and ataxia. This matter-of-factness is also generated through Charisse's narration, her in-depth explanations of different mobility aids, and how her CP and ataxia have, over the course of her life, affected her movement. In this way, disability vlogging becomes a practice through which Charisse films herself into being, constructing her disabled subjectivity and reauthoring her audience's experiences of her body-mind differences. In the act of sharing her experience and embodied knowledge, Charisse pushes back against the ageist and sexist, ableist, and assumption that she does not know or understand her own disabled body mind. For Charisse and other disabled girls in my book and throughout my research projects, disability vlogs function as narrative affective spaces through which they move through and enter into new socio-political meanings of embodiment. Disability vlogging, then, is also a practice of archiving knowledge and feeling, a corpistemology of disabled girlhood as a resource for others. Although the platform architecture of TikTok and its affordances are different than YouTube, and I can speak more about this in the Q&A, TikTok, like YouTube, has also become a space of disabled girls' participatory culture, where in producing, uploading, and interacting with videos and others, disabled girls construct their subjectivities, perform their identities, and cultivate community through participating in network publics or disability intimate publics of their own making. In January 2025, as the United States was on the precipice of a TikTok ban, many disabled users took to the platform to voice their distress, mourning the death of TikTok, their community, and potentially their income. To a snippet of Kendrick Lamar's Not Like Us, one disabled young woman posted a video with the following text: "Anyone else crashing out over the TikTok ban? I've learned so much about myself and the world. I can't believe my community might be gone." Another disabled young woman posted a video from her bed with the text: "Most of my income will be taken away when this app is banned this month. I'm disabled and I can't work. The only way I make money is through social media right now." Moving beyond visibility and representation espoused by the Forbes article at the beginning of this presentation, laid bare in these statements are the material and effective entanglements of platforms and the disabled girl quotidian. As platforms like TikTok have become a ubiquitous part of 21st century life, embedded in our day-to-day quotidian rhythms and routines, the looming death of TikTok brings a whole new set of questions about disability, girlhood, intimacy, and social media to the fore. What does it mean to be tethered to not only culture but life via our smartphones? What does it mean and look like to grieve a platform? And what does cripping girlhood look like in this new era of platform capitalism and creeping techno-fascism? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. A lot there to discuss, which hopefully we will be able to touch on later during the Q&A, including you really show very compellingly how, as you put it, girls, maybe children more broadly, are forerunners of creep activism and thinking, and how they serve as and also provide resources for others, but also the material dimension of some of these platforms. So all of these are really crucial issues for us to explore further if we have the time. So thank you very much for that. We now turn to a presentation by Antonius, whose topic is The Pursuit of Development, Deconstructing Developmentalism from a Critical Disability Studies and Disabled Children's Childhood Studies Perspective. So, Antonius, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hedi. I'm gonna share my PowerPoint. Can I make sure that this is visible to everyone? That's great,
Yeah.
Thank you. So hello everyone, and thanks for attending today's webinar. Thanks to Hedi for organizing this webinar and for his invitation too. I'm Antonios Ktenidis. I'm based in the School of Education at the University of Sheffield, and the title of my presentation is The Pursuit of Development, Deconstructing Developmentalism from a Critical Disability Studies and Disabled Children's Childhood Studies Perspective. The first part of the title, The Pursuit of Development, was inspired by the title of the film, The Pursuit of Happiness. And I have prepared some slides for today's presentation, some of which are wordier than others. Apologies in advance, but I did want to share with you some quotes which have shaped my thinking. Please feel free to enable closed captioning. I know Hedi put that as already something embedded, and spot how my Greek accent is translated by Zoom. So the structure for today's presentation is the following. I will first briefly introduce you to critical disability studies, disabled children's childhood studies, and developmentalism. And secondly, I will engage in a critique of developmentalism in the form of short provocations with reference to the World Health Organization's growth standards. I will then conclude with some final thoughts. And I have to admit at this point, this is a quite ambitious 12-minute presentation, but let's see how that goes. So Mikosa and Shuttleworth propose that, and I'm quoting here, that critical disability studies has accompanied the social, political, and intellectual re-evaluation of explanatory paradigms used to understand the lived experience of disabled people and potential ways forward for social, political, and economic change. And according to Goodley, Lotham, Lydiard, and Ranswick Cole, what critical disability studies has done is to welcome in a small smorgasbord of perspectives drawn from inside and outside of the disability experience. Critical disability studies is a location populated by people who advocate building upon the foundational perspectives of disability studies, whilst integrating new and transformative agendas associated with post-colonial, queer, and feminist theories. This has been the case because, as Mikosa and Shuttleworth claim, the sheer diversity of disabled people, that is the variety and degrees of their impairments and their intersection with other relevant social categories of experience, demands a much broader and contextual interrogation of their restrictions. To that effect, critical disability studies draws from a much more eclectic mix of critical theories than earlier work in disability studies. So critical disability studies question discourses and ideologies such as ableism and disableism and their intersections with other forms of discrimination which permeate and materialize in everyday life, marginalizing and excluding disabled people. According to the feminist disabled scholar Carol Thomas, disableism is defined as a form of social oppression involving the social imposition of restrictions of activity on people with impairments and the socially engendered undermining of their psycho-emotional well-being. And they choose this particular definition because of the latter part where the psycho-emotional toll that disableism has on disabled people is acknowledged. On the other hand, Woolbrink defines ableism as a set of beliefs, processes, and practices that produce, based on abilities one exhibits or values, a particular understanding of oneself, one's body and one's relationship with others of humanity, other species, and the environment, and include how one is judged by others. Disabled Children's Childhood Studies, a sibling of critical disability studies, explore how disabled children's lives have often been discussed through medical concepts of disability rather than concepts of childhood. Western understandings of childhood have defined disabled children against child development norms and have provided the rationale for segregated or special welfare and education provision. In contrast, disabled children's childhood studies begins with a view that studies of children's impairment are not studies of their childhoods. Disabled children's childhood studies demands ethical research practices that position disabled children and young people at the center of the inquiry outside of the shadow of perceived norms. So according to Lydiard, Rajwi Cole, and Tilly Curran, disabled children's childhood studies aims to draw in and upon the global, to situate geopolitically disabled childhoods in their wider global context. This has been a central tenet of disabled children's childhood studies since its inception, to both contest global norms around disability, childhood, family, bodies, and community, while at the same time disrupting the dominance of global North accounts and Euro-American ethnocentric understandings of what constitutes both childhood and disability. Developmentalism is an ideology linked to developmental psychology. The feminist author Walkerdin proposes that developmental psychology is premised upon the construction of an object of study, the developing child, and that the very object is not real, not timeless, but produced for particular purposes within very specific historical, social, and political conditions. She further argues that developmental psychology is a kind of story, but what is important here is the kind of story which developmental psychology claims to be: grand, totalizing story, the story of children's development. So developmentalism as an ideology materializes in everyday structures, practices, and so on. An example would be school furniture, desks, chairs, are designed with a typically developing, in quotation marks, child in mind. And here is my attempt to create, potentially unsuccessfully, a Venn diagram to explain my work. Specifically, I try to look into how developmentalism and its implications in terms of how we understand disability and childhood can be critiqued from a critical disability studies and the disabled children's childhood studies perspective. So I would like to do so by exploring how the World Health Organization's growth standards produce the universal developing child. So these standards demonstrated on the screen were launched in April 2006 and were aimed to be adopted at an international level. The reason put forward by Dionis, a pediatrist, and his colleagues for the production of these standards was the need for the early diagnosis of, in quotation marks, poor growth. And they argue that the assessment of growth in children is important for monitoring health status, identifying deviations from normality, and determining the effectiveness of interventions. The significance of timely detection of poor growth in early life resides in its association with adverse functional consequences, including poor cognition and educational performance, low adult wages, lost productivity, and when accompanied by excessive weight gain later in childhood, increased risk of nutrition-related chronic diseases. That's what this medical team argued about the construction of those standards. So in the next slides, I would like to explore how such standards perpetuate developmentalism, as well as developmentalism's intersections with other forms of discrimination. And to do so, I will offer 4 short with a capital S provocations. Provocation number 1, developmentalism intersects with disableism. Leonard Davis asserts that to understand the disabled body, one must return to the concept of the norm, the normal body. He discusses how Adolphe Quetelet, a French statistician, introduced the idea of the normal distribution to the distribution of human features, such as weight and height. Quetelet then went on to construct the average man, included in this slide, with this abstract human being the average of all human attributes in a given country. Growth standards, I argue, adopt a similar approach in terms of producing the normally developing body, and as a consequence, the abnormal one, the one that deviates and is in need of fixing and normalization. Similar to the normal distribution or the bell curve for intelligence, those bodies which deviate from the norm are constructed as at risk and they are pathologized. Provocation number 2, developmentalism intersects with ableism. Growth standards perpetuate ableism through the production and reproduction of the normatively typically developing child who is meeting or not the developmental milestones set in the growth standards. So the message they are trying to convey is that unless you grow according to these species typical standards and embody the corporeal standard, your body is understood as flawed, and it becomes or it turns into a sign of for intervention. My provocation number 3, developmentalism intersects with colonialism. The World Health Organization's growth standards are presented as universal, meaning that all children, independent of where they are born, should be growing accordingly. However, I argue that the universality of these standards is indicative of the globalization of medicalization and the colonial power of the global North to impose its epistemic cultures on the global South and legitimate the Western corporeal standard as the only validated mode of being. To achieve this, WHO has offices as shown in the map in different regions. Such offices contribute to the monitoring of the extent to which the recommended practices of WHO, including the growth standards, are adopted or not. And provocation number 4, developmentalism intersects with heightism, which I propose is a form of discrimination that is still less acknowledged. So from the moment we are born, we are constantly, and even before, constantly measured our weight, our height, and so on. And such measurements act as signs of good or not development. A child growing up taller is something to be celebrated, whereas a child not growing following the developmentalist milestones of growth standards provokes fear, suspicion. Their body's refusal to develop is read as a threat. Therefore, the desire to grow taller is taught and planted early on, with such an expectation to grow taller becoming internalized by the child themselves, concealing the highest underpinnings of such expectations. The arborescent, tree-like ways we come to understand physical growth are actually taken for granted without leaving any space for understanding growth differently. And I have a picture here of a young child standing in front of a tree that is used as a way of measuring children's height. So I would like to conclude by inviting you basically to reflect on the pursuit and tyranny of development and developmentalism in disabled childhoods and beyond, and how it makes and unmakes disabled children and young people, to quote our colleague Harriet Cooper. I would like you to reflect on how developmentalism materializes in everyday life, from measurements and growth charts to ways of being, ways of behaving, ways of learning, and so on. And last but not least, I would invite you to reimagine developmental paradigms that acknowledge and celebrate the diversity of disabled childhoods, which shift from arborescent, fixed, colonial, ableist, normative routes of development to rhizomatic, interdependent, anti-ableist affirmative routes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Antonios. That was extremely helpful, I think, for the entire session in terms of providing a theoretical framework for many of the issues we are discussing. And it's interesting to think about how, and you alluded to that to an extent, how childhood itself is often seen as a deviation from the norm if the norm is adulthood, and how childhood often is considered as disability of sort. So yeah, there's a lot to say about that. I'm also thinking about writing on adultism and how that overlaps with ableism and so forth. So there's a lot. It's a very theoretically rich presentation. Thank you for that. Okay, so Susan's presentation will be on the topic of rurality, intersectionality, and childhood disability. And the question posed by Susan is, what does rural life mean for disabled children? Susan, the mic is yours.
Okay, so hopefully everyone can hear me all right. So I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to speak on rurality, intersectionality, and childhood disability. In this presentation, I will explore socio-cultural discourses and practices surrounding disabled children and rurality. And my starting premise will really be that rurality is a place-based identity and an experience that is oftentimes omitted from discourse and discussion on the intersectionality of disability. I will proceed by using evidence from a scoping review that is published in Sociologia Ruralis. And in particular, I'm going to focus on three themes that emerged from that research to offer some theoretical provocations. And these provocations will speak to that question. What does rural life mean for disabled children and their families? So, whoops, sorry, there we go. So just a starting disclaimer on language. So I'm using the term disabled children, and I will be using that. I might use that in addition to using the term children with disabilities. So I just want to acknowledge that obviously, there are limitations with all language around disability. My intention in using the term disabled children is just to conceptualize disability as something that is done onto the child rather than belonging to the child or being the fault of the child. And so in that way, I'm kind of making disability something socio-political in nature, something that exists outside of the child's body and away from impairment. I also want to start off by setting the scene in terms of my use of the word rurality, and that rurality is really an identity position as well as a place-based experience. And it's often thought of, I would suggest in a limiting way, as being sort of the opposite to urbanism. So it's to do with rural life as a geographical location, as an experience, as a way of life, as an identity. And really, I would suggest that rurality itself is often sort of maybe omitted from identity politics. So it's not always a spotlight identity when we think about intersectionality and critical disability studies. So why consider rurality and childhood disability? I would suggest that rurality as an experience and a place-based identity affects disabled children as well as their advocates and allies in many important ways, including related to identity formation, service accessibility, social embeddedness, quality of life. And so we will explore these a little further. So just really quickly about the method for the scoping review. So I used a lot of established and existing guidances for the scoping review in order to inform the method. The full description of the method is provided in the publication. But I would have used predetermined search terms that would have been screened by an expert subject librarian, and I would have searched databases in a transparent and replicable manner. And I have the databases available on screen. The key piece around the theory that I used is I really tried to draw on a framework of critical disability studies and intersectionality, and how I operationalized theory into the method of the scoping review was by using the scoping review to gather the literature together, to refine that literature and arrive at a final sample, but then to extract theoretical conventions from critical disabilities and intersectionality, and then use them to actually hand code the literature, similar to what would have been done with the classic thematic analysis approach. So in a way, that's how I kind of embedded and operationalized the theory into the analysis. So kind of keeping that method in mind, I'm just going to share a few comments and thoughts about some of the findings that came up from this sort of theoretical analysis of literature sourced through a scoping review method. So there are three themes that I will briefly speak to. The first theme refers to practical concerns and accessibility. So just a reminder, we're talking about rurality and childhood disability, and what does rural life and rurality mean for children with disabilities and their families. And the first piece was quite practical. So issues that came up in the literature were things along the lines of, for instance, accessibility. So maybe negotiating diverse rural and agricultural terrain where there might be mobility impairments, there might be various factors coming into play, and the literature would have suggested that sometimes there can be difficulties with accessing services, whether it's medical services, hospitals, and in some ways that can function to disadvantage rural communities. And so then contrasting that, for instance, to rural life, some of the literature alluded to maybe crime statistics that would be present in certain urban areas that would relate to things like hate crime that can be linked to disability. So what came out really in the literature was a lot of pragmatic and practical concerns, where there would be trends that might be visible in rural life versus kind of urban settings. Another example was accessing educational and employment institutions, and how some rural communities might be disadvantaged in a sort of twofold way, both by the lack of accessibility related to rural geography, but how that can also intersect with accessibility issues related to disability. So there were practical concerns. The second theme refers to socio-cultural constructions of rurality and disability. So an example of this was the rural ideal, as it was portrayed in children's literature, where maybe rural childhoods were portrayed as being about open air and farm animals and healthy living. And there was this portrayal of a rural ideal that kind of denied some of the harsh realities of rural life. And this intersected in some ways with disability. For instance, how there can be labor market exploitation of people who are working hard in rural settings and are not reaping the benefits of the natural resources of rural communities, but also maybe are experiencing a level of exploitation. And this intersects with disability because much of the research speaks to the fact that children, disabled children, and families in which there are disabled children experience a higher likelihood of poverty. And so poverty is kind of a practical concern there. And really, the socio-cultural constructions of rurality and disability can sometimes portray an image of a rural ideal that omits some of the practical difficulties of rural life for disabled communities. And the final theme I want to just touch on before kind of finishing up is around intersectionality and rural childhood disability. So in the literature that was analysed, there were a lot of stereotyped cultural images of both rural and urban life. And these stereotyped images of rurality took effect within the practicalities of life in many ways. So, for instance, there was literature that alluded to children making applications for opportunities, be it educational scholarships or other things, and that in doing so, they felt that maybe their identity was discriminated against, or their family felt that there was a level of discrimination in that. But also, I suppose, what came out is rurality and being rural in itself was sort of seen as an identity, was stereotyped in some ways. So there was a sense of kind of stigmatization around rurality, which both had positive and negative effects. But there also was really that kind of wider message that rurality is an important identity position, and it is interpreted as an identity position, and therefore it does have a rightful place in debates and theorization and scholarship and discourse around intersectionality. So overall, these were the three themes that kind of emerged from the analysis in this paper. And I suppose my intention was not to sort of exhaustively or conclusively cover all the content within the three themes, but maybe offer some provocations out of that. So that leads me to conclude. So rurality has powerful implications for social equality and really intersects with identity. And I suppose the key message out of the research was that it intersects in really powerful ways with childhood disability. There are powerful socio-cultural constructions of rurality and disability, and these are abundant and they're diverse. And they indicate that there's a real need for an appropriate recognition of the challenges and opportunities and the various realities of disabled rural life. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. That's such an important presentation. I think you really this overview really highlighted or a gap there in many discussions of childhood and disability. And also, I think you alluded to when you talked about idealized versions or images of rurality, you alluded to the fact that there isn't one rurality, actually. There are ruralities just as there are childhoods. I was also thinking when you were talking about the implications for access about Anastasia's paper, actually, because access means the horizons of accessibility really change in light of social media. So I wonder, it's just an open question, maybe we can return to it afterwards, what accessibility could mean to children with disabilities in rural communities in light of social media, with all the potential and the pitfalls that presents. So thank you all three of you. There's so much to unpack further then. So I want us to start doing some of that through a discussion. So we said we'll have a brief discussion, panel discussion. Let's focus on one question, which I want to show everyone also to make it easier to follow. So hopefully you can see the question now. And it is, what are the ethical, it's quite a long-winded question, so I think that's why it's useful to see it. What are the ethical, methodological, and intersectional considerations in researching disabled childhoods? And I think some of you have touched to varying degrees on this question. This question entails a number of questions within it, but that also enables each of you to focus on whatever you find speaks most directly to your interest. So maybe just to make things a bit more interesting, we can have a different order of speakers this time. Antonius, would you like to start maybe?
Sure, I don't mind. Can give it a try. Thank you so much again, Hedi, for putting those questions together. And I think I try to think some of the issues, starting with the ethical issues. And I'm in the moment co-authoring a paper with a colleague of mine called Dr. Martina Smith around how developmentalism permeates institutional ethics. So to do any empirical work in most institutions, you are expected to submit this ethics application that is then reviewed by a committee with knowledge around an ethics. And there is a long history of how ethical guidelines came into existence in the first place to protect potential participants from harm. But what I want to argue and reverse maybe the argument is that institutional ethics and ethical guidelines can also perpetuate marginalization, exclusion of disabled children and young people in particular. And they do that through mechanism or technologies of labeling, for example, such participants as vulnerable. So in the UK context, at least, when you are expected to work with disabled participants, and then also with those who are children or young people, so below the age of 18, they are constructed as doubly vulnerable, and therefore more attention needs to be paid in how you're actually recruiting and so on. Sometimes they are described as hard to reach populations, putting the blame on the population rather than how those guidelines can be very restraining in how they do things. But going back to the argument about developmentalism, I think it speaks volumes of who is seen as this capable participant to take part in research without any additional risks, needs, and so on, and which participants are rendered as vulnerable, with the vulnerability being an innate rather than an external mechanism. So I think we're trying to push against of, although this ethics approval is a quite essential step to engage in research with disabled children and young people, it can also actually produces the opposite outcomes. Similarly, I talked about vulnerability. I think the idea of sensitive issues and what comes to be constructed as such, the idea that some people want to talk about some issues which are constructed as sensitive, but many times it's actually the opposite, that people very much would like to discuss experiences of disableism and ableism and so on. And then when it comes to the other part of the question, when it comes to the methodological and the intersectional, I think what disability does is to disrupt the research methodologies, research methods, which are very much rely on ableism. We rarely question the ableist underpinnings of research methods and methodologies. And I'm thinking here even some sort of innate hierarchies of engaging disabled children and young people. For example, young children, young people who are able to articulate through the means of voice. So those children, young people who might be non-verbal, again, another layer of, oh, our methods of interviewing won't work. And then we need to either choose other participants or try to find other research methods. And thinking here about, in intersectional terms, going back to Suzanne's presentation, I'm thinking, how are disabled children and young people from rural areas are included in research? How are they reached out? How about indigenous disabled children and young people, queer and trans disabled young people? Why are we again privileging certain voices of disabled childhoods, and at the same time we still marginalize and silence other voices? So I'll keep it there so I can hear from the colleagues as well.
Thank you so much. That's really thought-provoking. I'll just say in the meantime that in the chat we have a comment on, so I'm saying it now because it relates to what you've said, Antonius. Brenda Herbert kind of echoes what you were saying, and she says, this is my experience with working with children who have experienced domestic abuse. They want to contribute to knowledge creation, but are often ignored. So one of the issues you touched on. Thank you very much for that. Susan, would you like to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I would echo everything that's been said so far. When I thought a little bit about this question, I also thought a little bit about ableism and the idea that we need not focus on disability at all times to solve the problems that disabled communities face, but it's about also looking at that idea of being abled and so-called abled populations and focusing on them. And I thought a little bit about rurality and, you know, children with disabilities and a lot of wider questions that are addressed well beyond disability studies would have significant implications for rural disabled children. For instance, climate change has differing impacts on you depending on your global location. Trends in migrancy and mobility and how, depending on where you're located, the opportunities that you have, a disabled child might be overlooked for opportunities to migrate, for instance, to the city. And you mentioned technology, actually. At one point earlier, and yes, that's something that actually came up in my literature, that technology provides this wonderful opportunity for disabled children who otherwise might be geographically isolated because of a lack of accessible infrastructure around them. So there were all these wider topics. And I think when I was considering, you know, the ethics and methodological implications of, you know, researching disabled children, I sometimes think that it kind of lies very much within the remit of researchers that are seen to be within the disability community to kind of look at these topics from a disability standpoint, rather than, for instance, you know, researchers who are looking at these topics, ensuring that they have inclusive methodologies and approaches. So they're kind of reflections really on the question. I suppose the other piece I just, as far as ableism, that was kind of alluded to as well, is about the inclusion of children with, who communicate in a diversity of ways. And I suppose I do think that this is a really big problem in research, actually, that when you have children who maybe are labeled from a medical approach as being profound disability, or that are nonverbal, or, while there is this clear recognition that it's so important that their voices are included and represented, I would suggest that we still don't have good methodologies for doing this. It's a very practical problem. So I suppose they're just some considerations from my viewpoint to kind of add to what's already been stated.
Thank you so much. And there's a scholarship more broadly on voice within childhood studies, and I think the term voice itself is problematic. We associate people's perspectives with their voice. And I'll just mention, I don't want to say too much, I'll just mention that in relation to babies, there is also interesting research, those who haven't developed language skills yet. Even in relation to toddlers, there's interesting theoretical work on how their wishes and perspectives can be gauged through nonverbal channels, and they can be gauged. They can be grappled with. Susan, any thoughts? Sorry, Susan, Anastasia.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Everyone's perspective is so fascinating. So when I first started thinking about this question, I was really reminded of when I was in the process of writing my book. I was really thinking deeply about how to ethically write about the disabled girl specifically. And I kind of said a little bit in my presentation that, oftentimes disabled children, especially, are treated by academics as like objects of theory, right? Just as research subjects, rather than subjects who like have a perspective and who theorize about their lives. So, I think that when I was really deeply thinking about how I could write the disabled girl with care, there are like a couple things that I was thinking about. Um, I first kind of, was really thinking about how all of our works really can't be divorced from like the legacies of academic extractivism. But there are certain things we can do in order to be like accountable to the people that we write about and think about. And one thing that I was really using, I guess, or two people, a lot of Harriet Cooper's work on disabled children's childhood studies. And Antonio's brought this up already, but kind of really thinking, what do disabled children want to tell us about themselves instead of presuming we know like what they want to say, or we know better in terms of our adult perspective. But also to think about like their perspectives or their voices, we really have to think about how disabled childhood has been constructive and how their voices have been, quote, made through different discourses of developmentalism. But when I was writing, I really was thinking like I didn't want to only foreground disabled children's or disabled girls' perspectives or their voices, but also to kind of really think critically about what normal childhood or normal disabled girl or normal girl voices have been considered. Also, one other thing I'm going to say is in my book, when I use cripping girlhood as a heuristic, I was really invested in not only critiquing these representations of disabled girlhood that are produced by people who are not disabled girls. So I look at documentaries, I look at news stories, but all of these representations are representations that are constructed and produced and circulated by people who aren't disabled girls. So I really felt that it was important for me to have the self-representational piece in my book and in my research to give this kind of counter narrative that disabled girls themselves are producing and circulating. I felt that it was really important to think about how do I center disabled girls' desires, even if it makes adults uncomfortable, um, and kind of how to showcase disabled girlhood in its complexity, um, instead of kind of re-narrativizing stereotypes or kind of like easy ways to think about disabled girlhood. Yeah, so that's, I guess, what I have to say about that.
Thank you very much. Okay, there's a lot that we could develop further, and luckily we have the time to do some of that. Because I do want to turn to the Q&A section, but also to allow all of you during that, if you want to comment on each other's presentations and remarks, if you have any thought, or if you want to add anything to what you said earlier. I'll just say, Anastasia, as you were speaking, I was also thinking about some related challenges that in relation to children's rights and policies relating to children, not just within research with children. Some of the common criticisms, increasingly by critical childhood studies, in that context, is that we are speaking of the right of the child to be heard, but quite often what happens is that that right is invoked in order to children be heard, but then only listen to if what they say aligns sufficiently with what adults already think. So that challenge in a different iteration or version of it also arises in a research context, especially in relation to girls with disabilities, as you mentioned, but related context as well. So I'll just read comment/question that we have here in the chat, and I'll invite the rest of you if you want to add any questions or comments either in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, turn your camera on shortly, you're welcome to do that. First, I'll read the comment here, just in case anyone has any thoughts about that. But I suggest we collect a few questions. I can add my own. So here's what the comment says. Hello, Shafali here. This is from Shafali Chadha. I completed my master's from the Department of Education at the University of Delhi in India 2 years ago. In alignment with the leading question in this discussion, I had a hard time situating a particular instance in my master's dissertation vis-a-vis ethics, methodology, and research on disabled childhood. I was reaching out to parents of disabled children in India for gathering data on their experiences on getting an assessment of disability. My definition of children was anyone under 18. I came in touch with somebody who identified herself as a mother of a child with disability. In the middle of the interview, she told me that her child is no more, but he would have been 17 today, and that she is still his mother. I continued the interview as is, and later did include her interview in my discussion, given I believed her lived experiences were just as valuable. What is your perspective on such an instance? Any speaker, attendee, or the moderator may take this up if you feel it's valuable to the discussion here. So thank you for that intervention. Is there anyone else that wants to add or present a question or a comment to any of our speakers? If so, feel free to unmute yourself. Maybe I can jump in and just say, so I'm buying you some time to think how and if you have any thoughts relating to the question I just read out. Another theme, maybe if you could speak a bit about, is what broader lessons your presentations and your work more broadly has for critical childhood studies, if you had any thoughts about that. So that's a very broad theme, but since we do have some time, maybe we can discuss that. So Susan, would you like to go first? Any thoughts about that? There's so much you could just pick whatever you want to talk about, really.
No problem. Would you, I can share a comment also on the query that was
Absolutely.
raised. I would say just from my viewpoint that if somebody was considering including views, that it might relate to the ontological and epistemological framework of their study. So if they're coming from maybe a constructivist viewpoint, and it is their explicit intention to gather the subjective views of a participant, then from, it makes complete sense to me that they could include a narrative of somebody who is no longer here because it's still valid what is being shared. So I don't know what that's worth, but that's my kind of view on that. And then as far as kind of the wider implications, I suppose, of my study, overall, I suppose, for a kind of critical academia around childhood, I suppose kind of one of the things that stood out to me as well in my research, and I actually replicated some research I did previously in Ireland, is that some of the children and families that I would have spoken to, albeit with a limited sample population, would have spoke about some really significant practical problems that they face. And so that could be poverty related to, if we use the idea of rurality, related to lack of employment opportunities, and then disability discrimination on top of that. It could be lack of medical support. So there were some real practical problems, and it troubled me a little that some families I spoke to sort of said that they really, welcomed this kind of critical theorization. They welcomed people researching and examining and looking into and advocating for their circumstances. And that for them, it didn't necessarily matter so much whether the person who was researching their circumstances had disability or not. It didn't really matter. They appreciated the support, I guess, is what came across. And on a wider level, sometimes it troubles me that it's so important for us to make sure that disability research is done well, and that we challenge biases, and that we do the research really well, but at the same time we want to create a sort of academic community, I guess, that encourages research around disability. So that's just kind of some thoughts that I sort of had around rurality and disability. And I just wanted to mention as well, I think colleagues' presentations were absolutely fascinating, as I saw a lot of overlaps indeed between the three presentations. And I was excited about a lot of the ideas, be it, whether it was related to developmentalism, or how, the internet gave opportunities for people to really narrate their stories in spaces where they had audience to do that, and that they had a kind of empowerment around it. So that was very exciting. So I saw a lot of overlaps there. So there's some, I guess, general thoughts.
Thank you very much. Anastasia, any thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. So, my work specifically looks at disabled girls and young women. And I think throughout doing my research, I've really come to, I guess, understand or see how thinking through the disabled girl really allows us to think about how childhood obviously has its own norms, and how childhood can, in and of itself, the way it's constructed, function like as a disciplinary apparatus. So for so many of the disabled girls that I have really thought critically about and have written about, their girlhood fundamentally challenges what we think of as girlhood. Girlhood is premised, especially in the US and in the West, it's kind of constructed as this kind of like innocent, idyllic time. but also it's kind of framed as this space and time where you're training to become a woman. You are always measured against this future that is kind of premised for you. And I would say that disabled girls and girlhoods kind of challenge these ideas where they're, I guess, I'll just give one example really very quickly. In one of my chapters, I look at disabled girl handlers and their service dogs, and I juxtapose the construction of disabled girl handlers and service dogs like in the media with actual narratives that disabled girl handlers upload and produce and post on TikTok. And so what I see in this kind of one microcosm of this, what I'm trying to say is that in these representations that circulate in mainstream media, the service dog is constructed as this animal that's going to rehabilitate the disabled girl to make the disabled girl more normal, to make the disabled girl have a more normal girlhood, wherein she's going to grow up and be independent, possibly have a job. But these narratives that disabled girls post on TikTok really kind of tell a different story. In these narratives, disabled girls speak about the fundamental interdependency that they have with their dog. So instead of this idea that growing up means desiring and wanting autonomy and independence, they present this counter narrative where actually growing up means claiming their crip subjectivity, and it means this care and interdependence that they forge with their service dog. So that's just kind of one example.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much. Antonios?
Lots and lots of thoughts, which I'm trying to organize in my mind, and to an extent I struggle, but I'll try to do my best. Firstly, attending to Safali's comment and question, I think if I were to reverse the question would be, would it have meant to exclude that mother or cease the interview as it was taking place? Would that be considered ethical? And then what would it mean to exclude the story that she shared with you as a researcher from the actual analysis? Would that be a form of symbolic violence in terms of how analysis is a matter of choosing and what goes in and what is left out? And I think, again, my colleague Kirsty Lydiard, she was leading a project called Living Life to the Fullest, which was about children with life-limiting impairments. And she was focusing again on disabled young women with such labels and what it meant for them to live a life which would at some point terminate sooner than other normative life expectations. And they think it's so important to think about those matters and to give people a chance when they want those stories to be listened to for this to happen. And then also think about the impact that these stories can have in terms of how we come to think then of disability, death, and so on. So I think that was the right approach in my mind in that sense. When it comes to your question, Hedi, I think I want to start by sort of addressing an elephant in the room, I feel, which is the absent presence of disabled childhoods from critical approaches to childhoods. So, for example, there was so much attention to the new sociology of childhood, recognizing children as agentic, as a subject who we need to listen to, but no reference to disabled childhoods. And they feel sometimes even social constructions of childhoods can remain or be ableist in certain ways. I think children's geographies, many fields that seem to prioritize children, disability remains at the periphery or completely excluded. And I think that's something important to note. When it comes to what you mentioned earlier about adultism, I think in my work, I do try to talk to an extent about infantilization. So treating somebody as a child and what that means. And I think there is some great scholarship around this idea of child as metaphor that Erica Berman and China Mills have started reading about. So what does it mean to be treated as a child, or even if you're an adult, to be treated because you're childlike? And they think, again, there are colonial underpinnings there of certain populations in the global south being thought as such. But in my work in particular, I'm trying to bring up heightism, and my research was focusing on young people with dwarfism. And they was looking into secondary schools because, again, it's during puberty where there is this developmentalist expectation of the growth spurt where children's bodies will grow taller. But that's not actually the occasion for all children. There are different impairments that will impact one's growth. And what they were bringing up was how infantilization actually linked with ableism, linked with disableism, how height was associated with one's intelligence and ability to do things, and how that had an overall impact and the psycho-emotional toll in their lives. So I think there is more to talk when we talk about social constructions of childhoods. I think thinking about the implications also that come with such frameworks and centering disability as well is quite important.
Absolutely. I'm thinking as you're speaking, Antonio, so you mentioned Erica Berman's writing on child as method, where one of her key arguments is that basically the metaphor of the child can be an entry point for thinking about broader issues that don't necessarily directly focus on children in the narrow sense of the word. I was thinking both about how central infantilization was to empire as a project, but also I did some work recently on an unrelated topic, which is child refugees. And one of the things we see when child refugees from the global south arrive in the global north, often their ages are unknown. So it's actually unknown whether they are children in our sense of the word or not. And that has huge implications. And in order to assess whether they are truly children, often what immigration officers do, they use development charts based on local population to assess whether this looks like a child or doesn't look like a child. So developmentalism is central to these colonial-like modes of governance even today. And I think if we think about disability, childhood, developmentalism as a method, it really can potentially help us understand like a very broad range of issues. So yeah, that's very generative, like as a theoretical framework. Any other thoughts or questions from our audience? We do have a couple of minutes left, so you all have the opportunity in case you want to say or ask anything.
I actually have a question for the other panelists if there's no audience member with a question. But I'm
Go
just
for it.
curious, just because, my work is so heavily focused on girlhood and gender, and I want to know, how does gender, or does it show up in your research? So your research on like rurality and then your research on like heightism.
Yeah, so I might just comment briefly if that's okay next. It actually didn't come up as much as I thought, but there does seem to be limited amount of research on rurality as a kind of identity and experience anyway. Rural sociology would be a large field that would look at this. But there was kind of inklings of the idea that it wouldn't be proper for a girl to maybe be engaged with farm machinery and out there undertaking maybe the hard graft of farm work. So I do recall seeing that somewhere, and that was kind of a stereotyping of girls, and maybe that it's not what's seen as proper for a girl to do in a rural childhood. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, for the question. Great one. I think especially height and gender intersect in so many ways, and they'll try to give some of those examples, one of which is referring to my positionality as a short man of, let's say, 5 feet and 2 inches. And it's like psychology has managed to pathologize shortness when it comes to men and come up with this idea of the little man syndrome or the Napoleon syndrome, when short men like myself are expected to behave more aggressively to compensate for their lack of height. And they usually, when I interact with people, sometimes they will comment, "You're very calm, you're very kind, you don't have any Napoleon syndrome." And I'm like, how am I supposed to respond to that? Because to me, that's a quite heightist problematic comment. But if I call it out as such, then I'm almost fulfilling the expectation that, oh, I'm now being aggressive or insecure about my own height as a man in that sense. Then I'm thinking again about cultural representations and constructions of the short girl as this petite, cute, compared to the short boy who might be, again, weak, be seen, again, he's effeminate and so on, all the assumptions. But also thinking the other side of the spectrum of very tall children and their adultification, going back to Hedi's point about, for example, if a girl becomes taller in an early age, what does that mean in terms of how she is treated, in terms of how she's expected to behave, in terms of how she's interacting with others, and so on. So I think, and again, it can, thinking intersectionally, thinking about race as well, if we think about very tall men of color being constructed as potential threats because of their bodies. And when I teach, I usually say to my students, when we try to think in those intersectional terms, that if I walk on the street in the evening or at night, people most likely won't cross the road because they won't be intimidated by my own body because of height. But this is the signifiers of how we come to scale and read each other in that sense.
Thank you so much. As we all know, childhood itself as a category is deeply gendered and racialized and so forth. So yeah, I'll just read out a comment we have here in the chat. Brenda Herbert is saying, this has been a great space to think about the issues of childhood and disabilities. Thank you. So that goes to all three of you. This is our time for this session, so I will echo Brenda's comment and say this has been really a fantastic set of presentations and comments. You've given all of us and the viewers a lot to think about, and there are broader implications and questions that what you've said raise in relation to both disability and childhood. So that's really thought-provoking and interesting. So thank you, all three of you.